I was looking out the bedroom window this morning. Right in front of me was Magnolia Hayes Bell. It's a kind of flamingo pink, I suppose. And it's very, very early. Graham and I bought this particular grafted tree from Hayes Castle. And it was very expensive, I suppose. Probably doesn't sound so much today, but it's £60. And I think 60 or £65. Probably 30 years ago, you would have thought twice about it, shall we say. Anyway, it flowers regularly very early, but I looked out of the other side of the bedroom window, and there across in the woodland gardens, a white magnolia flowering away. Now, that's not happened before this early.
Hello and welcome to episode 119 of Talking Dirty. Over at East Ruston Old Vicarage, looking rather marvellous and snazzy in navy and green stripes, we have Alan Edward Herbert Gray, our happy and ever more handsome horticulturalist.
Well, thank you for that. And I tell you what, this is episode 119. You don't look a day over 118. You're smiling and happy and looking wonderful. Always with a touch of orange. I have to say the weather here today has been, well, very heavy rain to start with. The dogs didn't want to go out first thing this morning. Then we got wonderful blue sky. Now we've got blue sky and fluffy bits. And I think we're going to get some more rain this afternoon, but hopefully not too soon. How's Cambridge?
Quite windy. Poor baby ended up having a sleep in the garden with a little bit of a gust. So he's been well ventilated today. Now, you may remember us mentioning in I think it was the March East Ruston Old Vicarage special, that we were planning something extra special for Talking Dirty. We often mention species tulips. We're a little bit obsessed with Tulipa sprengeri, which excitingly I have got some seed, growing in the garden or in my tray and growing into ever bigger bulbs. But we want to talk about way more than just Tulipa sprengeri, and who better to do that than the Cambridge University Botanic Garden, where they host the National Collection of Species Tulips. We've got Simon Wallis, Senior Horticulturalist at Kathryn Bray, also Senior Horticulturalist in different areas of the garden, joining us on the podcast today. First of all, Simon, any middle names to share?
Just John, I'm afraid. Pretty uninteresting.
Very solid. Kathryn?
Grace.
Lovely. Beautiful names.
Very graceful.
Yeah, very grateful.
For people
Katie Gracie.
For people who are listening and you can't see the visuals, we're in the potting shed as we were for the orchid special we recorded with the Botanic Garden, and you've got some wonderful species tulips sneaking in on the edge of the camera, and we will obviously be adding lots of pictures to this episode as we delve into the collection. So first of all, how long has the Botanics had the National Collection of Species Tulips, and how many do you have?
Well, I think we have probably one of the oldest collections as far as the sort of a collection of plants was put together by the Ministry of Agriculture after the Second World War. And I think the gardens is the oldest collection now that can go all the way back to then, but it actually exists before as well. So there was a chap called William Dykes, and he was the chair of the RHS. I think it was back in the 1920s, and unfortunately, and he was a really big iris and really big tulip buff. He had lots, a great collection, I believe. He met a grim end on a road, and then his collection really got split up amongst various sort of organizations and institutions, and we were lucky enough to get a 12th of the collection. So we can actually go back to around about 1927. Which is pretty cool. And what is the oldest accession we have, the oldest dated tulip? I think we've got one in the collection about 1941. So that's pretty old. So that's coming up, that's over 80 years now, isn't it? So
with those, and obviously the whole point of a botanic garden having a collection is you can share with other botanic gardens. So I'm assuming that you're always not only growing from seed, but are you looking for like little dropper bulbs and bulblets and things? What happens when you have a bulb for all that time?
Well, tulips, that sort of thing. So you get the tulip, it grows, it does all its growing, it sort of finishes in the summer, it dies back. And generally what will happen, and this is, a really good difference between some of the big blousy ones we might grow in the garden and the species, they perenniate. So what will happen is the old tulip bulb will sort of deteriorate, but a new one will be offset next to it and grow on for next year. So, and if you're lucky, you'll also get lots of little babies for free. So we try and repot the collection every 1 to 2 years. And it's great when we always generally end up with more than we started with on the last repot. So we can hand a few around to teams outside, or if there are gardens interested, because some of our tulips have got really quite cool histories. So yeah, and we also prop as well by seed. So I've got some tulip seed actually. I wonder if you could see that on the camera.
Oh,
It's
look,
quite cool
yeah.
here.
Yeah.
So this is Tulipa tschimghanica, and it was collected by even wasn't you, Kathryn, or maybe it was Andrea last year in Kyrgyzstan. And so we sow that, and we sow it in a really odd mix. The easiest thing, I suppose, is like cat litter, really, and it's clean cat litter. But we use something called leca, and it's this sort of clay particulate, and that's all we sow our tulip seed into. We give it a little top dress of the same medium, and then we water it in, and we then generally let winter do its thing for us and hopefully break dormancy, and we get some seedlings the following year. So I've got another one here. So we sowed these, I've got it on the back here. We sowed this on the 20th of November last year. It's sat in a really cold glass house, and you can see the old seed heads are still hanging on.
Maybe I'll hold up a white piece of paper and maybe see in the background. It's quite sweet.
That's amazing.
Then that will take maybe, hopefully, 3 to 4 years before we get something that looks, like a tulip flower. So,
Right, Simon, can I just ask a question? Because when we were talking about the bulbs in pots, do you do anything to ripen the bulbs in the pots as the flowering goes over? Because I've heard that some people apply warmth to their bulbs to initiate future flowering.
That's a really good question, Alan. We don't really, but the one thing we do is we plunge all our pots. So all our pots are plunged in a sand bed, and that would certainly add, a molecule of central heating, if you like.
Yeah.
Pots, because I know not a lot of these plants don't like sort of variation at bulb height in the wild in temperature too much. So if we bed them in sand, those temperatures can sometimes just be a little bit more regulated. So yeah, they might well warm them up slightly during the summer.
Well, that's an interesting point, because you said that, that bulbs, they don't like heat at bulb height. And tulips, as we all know, they sometimes produce what's called a dropper bulb.
That's
from
right.
the base of the bulb that goes down. And is that to find the optimum height that the bulb wants to grow at?
Absolutely. So we were just saying we sowed some seed, and we sow that seed pretty much almost, maybe half a centimetre below the surface. So it's really quite high up. And by the time it's flowering, especially if it's in the wild, that bulb might be 30 to 40 centimetres down in the soil profile. And you've got these sort of like dropper bulbs, and they come from these sort of like roots that literally pull the bulb down to where it wants to go. And then once it's happy, that root dies away, and the tulip is then ready to sort of do its business and flower.
That explains something, because sometimes when I've been using tulips, I mean, I'm talking about hybrid tulips now, not species ones, but they all do it. But I think I've dug all the bulbs up and I take them away, and next year I put in a different color scheme, and it's pink and white, and there is one red flower.
Yeah,
and that's one that I've missed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like rogue red, isn't it? Definitely.
Yeah.
Now we need to delve into the Kyrgyzstan part of the story, because that's very exciting and it's sort of been happening over the past few years. But when you say you repot the collection every 1 to 2 years, how big is that collection? Because it sounds like it's probably quite a sizable job.
It is a reasonably large job, and also we have lots of other bulbs as well. Tulips just make up part of that, but I think we hold around about hopefully 58 to 60 species in the collection. How many tulip species there are, I think, is still up for debate. It might be a different number next week and then a different number in a couple of weeks' time, but I think we're settling around about 97 species at the moment. So we've got a good representation of that. And yeah, it's that's really cool. And Kyrgyzstan, where Kathryn's been, that's sort of like I suppose the epicenter of wild tulips, really. And can you remember how many species it is? Is it?
Yeah, I think that there's 53 tulip species that have been red listed in Kyrgyzstan, which is a pretty impressive feat for sure.
Can I ask one thing about the climate in Kyrgyzstan? Because I immediately sort of think it's quite harsh, and I'm thinking probably maybe it goes from one extreme to the other, very cold to very hot. Would that be correct?
That would be so true. I don't think that could be any more true. You know, 90% of the country is mountainous. We had
Yeah.
one day where we were sort of effectively driving through a desert, and we woke up from a nap and there were camels outside of the car. And then sort of within 2 hours, you know, we were right up sort of at the border near China and at 3,000 plus meters, and it was snowing and the car got snowed in. So it's got huge diversity.
Yeah.
What an amazing trip. So this was last year and you were out as part of the Botanic Gardens. It's a collaboration with Flora and Fauna International.
Yeah, so three sort of partner institutions in Kyrgyzstan were involved. There's the Botanic Garden in Bishkek, Flora and Fauna International, and also the National Academy of Sciences. So we were incredibly fortunate to travel around with these botanists who just knew everything so well. You know, we'd be driving around these little roadsides, and then we were in two cars, and the first one would just sort of screech to a halt, and they'd hop out, sort of scramble up the road verge and find something really cool. So they just knew where everything was. It was a fantastic sort of learning opportunity, and to be able to see the country as well was really exciting.
So when you see some of these tulips in the wild, where obviously there's a lot of different species, but what are some of the places you saw them?
We saw three different species when we were over there, and the different habitats were quite diverse. You know, so the new species that we were able to see, and sort of fortunately it was in flower, that was kind of like a quite heavily grazed meadow. So grazing is an issue for biodiversity in Kyrgyzstan. You know, you see these huge herds of goats and sheep, you know, thousands strong, crossing the mountains with sort of herders. So grazing is an issue, and a lot of tulip species grow in these alpine meadows. We were also able to see some on the road verges just growing in sort of very, very poor, sort of thick clay soils, you know, that looked like they were just sort of, you know, prone to quite frequent landslides. And then, you know, because the weather is variable, so I think that it affects the way that things are growing. But yeah, very diverse.
And this new one, which is named after the region where it was found, which is lovely, but it does mean that people like me have got to try and say it. So is it toktogulica?
It is, yes. Yeah. It was funny actually. I tried to do some research obviously before I went, and was getting a little bit overwhelmed with the diversity of plant names, and like, how am I going to learn all of these before we go? But there was we actually started to spot quite a lot of similarities. You know, Siberica is quite a common name.
Yeah.
Kyrgyzstanica, like all of these names that you can almost start to predict what it might be.
And toktogulica, I mean, nowadays, obviously, you can work out by actually studying the DNA what sets a plant apart. But what does it look like? What is it about it that sort of makes it different?
It's quite a diminutive species, so it's a yellow flower, small yellow flower. I'd say probably about sort of 10
10
centimeters.
centimeters, I would think. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
10 centimeters. And I was really lucky. The first trip that we went on, we actually went with Brett Wilson, who had been doing his PhD and obviously found it for the first time in the wild in 2019. And they were showing us that it was actually the tunic of the bulb which sort of visually set that species apart. So they sort of you know, lifted it thinking perhaps it wasn't anything special, but you know, we'll take it back to the lab and have a look. And then it did turn out to be a new species, which must have just...
Can I just butt in there? Sorry, and just I'd just like you to explain the word tunic, because I think if you just take the bulb without shoots and roots on it, it is the jacket that the bulb wears. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say that's a good
Yeah, I
definition.
think that's a really great definition. I mean, tulips are, you know, they're a great, you know, bulb, but the one thing that sort of tricks us all into identifying them, unfortunately for tulips, is colour. There's a lovely one called greigii, and we often see it, and I always imagined it, you know, to be this striking scarlet sort of red tulip with a black blotch, yellow pollen, and then these purple blotched leaves. Well, I was kind of maybe 20% right, you know, and then it comes in every other shade of yellow and orange across the whole spectrum. And sometimes it can be spotted leaves, sometimes it can't. And there's this lovely story I remember reading about that. It was in Kyrgyzstan, up near the Chinese border. And there's this mountain called the Red Mountain, and it's called this Red Mountain because it's covered apparently in Tulipa greigii. And the government employs this gentleman who lives in a house on the side of the mountain. And his sole job is to go and pick all the yellow and orange tulips. So they just end up with red at flowering time. I thought it was a great story. It shows that diversity of tulips. That sort of really did make me chuckle. But the tunics, so yeah, as you said, a great sort of way to actually tell us what species there are if we're not using DNA.
Yeah.
How hairy they are, how far the coat goes up the bulb, that sort of thing.
And the other thing about species tulips is that, I mean, for people like me as a gardener, I like them from the main reason I started growing them really was because they're more perennial than the hybrids.
Absolutely.
Much more perennial than the hybrids. But I was surprised when I first bought species tulips and this tiny little bag arrived with tiny little bulbs in it, which is not what as a gardener I was used to at all. And I thought, hello, I've been done here. Something's wrong. This is not right. But that's one thing.
Not value for money.
No, but I think, you know, in general, gardeners ought to be made aware of the fact that because they're species and they're not hybrids, they have much smaller bulbs in general.
They do, yeah. I mean, when we repot, we try and measure all our bulbs as well, or have a good idea of what size they are. So each year we can tell whether the tulip's getting better or it's getting weaker. But I mean, sometimes the tulip bulbs, especially on some of the smaller ones, like cretica can only sometimes be, what, 3 centimeters, 4 centimeters tall. And it's amazing. That gets all the leaf and all the flower and everything out of that tiny little bulb.
Yeah, yeah.
That's nature.
There's a lesson there, you know, because if people could pack a suitcase like that to go on holiday, it'd be fantastic.
Well, tell me about it. Yeah, we're going away for the Easter, and I've got 2 kids and 4 large suitcases, so I don't know what's going on.
Well, I've just done a trip only for a few days with a baby and 3 rucksacks. That was all we did.
Oh, good luck.
I'm winning on the packing front.
Can I just ask, wait, do you have a specific potting mix for growing tulips in pots? I mean, I'm taking on board, I grow some tulips in pots, and I'm looking to actually grow species tulips in pots, and I want to know how to look after them properly. So I've taken on board sand beds, and I've got a couple of places.
It's always good to plunge in the mix, I think. I mean, we have a mix made for us by an outside company, but I mean, if you're going out to buy compost, I'd get yourself something like a good John Innes, a good loam-based compost, John Innes number 3. And then I'd try and make it even more free draining. So I'd get some grit, some horticultural grit. I'd make sure you wash the grit before you mix it and you take all that dust off.
Yeah.
And try and get
that dust can actually, I mean, for people that are not aware of it, that dust can actually act a little bit like cement, can't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in our pots, we top dress all our pots with grit. Yeah. And I'm quite, I really want that washed before we use it as a top dress, because otherwise you get this capping just underneath.
Yeah, it sets hard.
Yeah. And can I just, for our American viewers, whenever we talk about potting grit, it doesn't exist seemingly in America, but I think it's chicken grit. I think that is the equivalent, just if you happen to be.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Chicken grit, you can get chicken grit in agricultural outlets.
Yes, you can. And the other thing people use is oyster shell as well.
Absolutely.
Again, which is fed to chickens. And this is fed to chickens really, because it goes into the guts and it gets into the gizzard, and then it grinds the food out.
That's right. And I think you can get it in various ways.
You need to know that, did you?
I mean, yeah, I'm not eating it, but yeah. But yeah, and also the top dress kind of really good as well. It's helped insulate the plants as well. It keeps those, I'm always amazed of sort of alpine plants. I always think of, it's one of my passions, I suppose. They're trying to escape those harsh winters, and tulips kind of similar, but they're actually trying to escape the harsh summers. So,
yes, cool.
And so they're trying to get away from those continental hot summers. And then what they really appreciate, especially in your garden, if you're planting them out in the garden, good bit of advice. I think the advice is it the Lord Mayor's show you're meant to plant your tulips out on, which is the second Saturday in November.
Yeah, it sounds about right, actually.
That's great, I suppose, if you're in London. Maybe not so great if you're up in Edinburgh. You might want to plant a few weeks earlier. Definitely nice sunny position. That's key. Tulips like sun. And we're not getting the sun in Cambridgeshire that we'd get in Kyrgyzstan or Turkmenistan or Turkey, for example. Nice and sunny. Try and give them a protected site as well, somewhere away from those winds. I mean, especially the species tulips, and also I think it stands for some of the big hybrids, something like Negrita or something like these really quite tall growing ones. They can be up to 50 centimeters tall. A harsh wind coming in, and we're meant to get 50-mile-per-hour winds this afternoon. That can easily snap a tulip. So sunny, protected, free draining soil. That's what we were talking about, free draining soil.
Yeah.
So that's what the tulips really like. In a pot, free draining, John Innes, add some grit, add some sand, add some osmocote as well. You know, they're hungry things, tulips.
A slow release fertilizer.
Yeah, slow release fertilizer. And when you're watering them in their growing season, definitely give them more feed. You know, something like a seaweed feed or a tomato feed would be absolutely fine. I try and do mine every 2 weeks once they're growing away, because they're hungry things.
That's worth knowing, because what you're actually doing is you're building up the bulb for the following year.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
this time of year, all that power is going in. If you just said it, Alan, to growing next year's bulb. If you don't feed them, you'll get most probably poor flowering the next year.
Yeah.
One of the good things about having, excess bulbs is, you can experiment with different ways of growing them. And I manage the rock garden here at the Botanics. And one of the things that we've been talking quite a lot about recently is trying to grow more species tulips in the ground and, experimenting with different locations there. So that's something that we're looking forward to doing soon.
And I
Well,
love
that's something
the
I'm
rock
thinking
garden.
about doing here in the Desert Wash, because the Desert Wash is a very, very free draining area. And it does get very, very hot, especially in summer of 2022. I mean, it was unbearable in there. But actually, there is a photograph on one of your tulip captions here, and it's Tulip Bakerii Lilac Wonder. But I mean, I'm looking at this and thinking that's a pretty little thing, and then I'm thinking, look at it, it's nestled right at the base of a Euphorbia wulfenii.
Yeah.
And I just think there's a planting idea straight away.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yellows and tulips, euphorbias and tulips, that sort of acidy yellow go really, really well with tulips.
Well, that acidy yellow will calm any arguments you ever have.
I must remember that.
And in Kyrgyzstan, when you've gone out there, Kathryn, you got to see the plants in the wild. And then is there a follow-up trip when they've set seed, where the seed is then collected and brought back?
Yeah, so when we were over there, we did see some plants that were setting seed, but unfortunately we didn't have permits to bring them back. So the main focus of our trip was to collect herbarium specimens and DNA samples. And also, we referred to it as a scouting trip. So we were really, looking at the kind of areas that it would be most useful to go back to on the second trip, which was seed collecting. So the organizations that we were with from Kyrgyzstan, they were able to collect some seed, but we didn't actually bring any back that first time, but they were able to collect some the second time round when the team sort of returned at the end of the summer.
So how does that work? I mean, just from a nerdy point of view, like you go out, obviously you've got your tulip seed heads. What's the whole process and how many can you bring back? And then what happens when you get them back?
It was quite a lengthy process, and I went on the first trip. So the second trip, I think, was a very different vibe. I think that from what I've heard, they spent all day collecting, and you do get up early on these collection trips. It sounds like this incredible venture, and it really is adventure. But it's really hard work, and you're just out in the field all day, sort of collecting things, and you find something that you think might be of interest, and you always have a scout round in the vicinity to see if there are other plants. So if there was like one individual or two individuals, you'd never think about taking either a herbarium specimen or seed. So you want to have sort of a healthy population where you know that you're not going to be affecting the native population, I guess. And then what we were doing was then just sort of trying to dig up the whole plant if possible. Obviously, if it's a tree, then you can't do that. But you'd want to, for herbarium specimens, have some kind of diagnostic factor. So you'd want to have fruit or flowers. And it was the same on the collection trip. I think that seed would just be collected, bagged, numbered, labeled, and then it would be the end of the day that you'd then sort through all of that. So as best they could for the collection, I think that they were trying to remove any sort of fleshy seed casing and just clean it the best you can. But we had a big effort when they got back as well. We had volunteers and trainees involved just to try and get the seed as clean as possible for storage. So I can't remember what they said, but I think they said it was like 81 hours worth of
I think it was. There was a lot of seed cleaning.
It took a long time.
Yeah.
So they were going to bed at like 2 a.m. most days, just trying to get as much done as possible. So I think that they had they had quite a lot to get through, whereas ours, we were just sort of trying to identify the plants that we'd seen and then pressing them in newspaper, which didn't take quite so long, I think.
Well, it really makes you appreciate the hard work that goes into a collection like yours, because then that seed you have been sowing, you've shown us those little seedlings, and you're going to be growing that on to then add to your collection, Simon.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's nice, that we can, I think in the last, is it 10 years, I think 15 new species of tulips have been found, mostly sort of in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. And to be involved with somebody like Bishkek Botanic Garden, so where we can do some ex situ conservation, because these guys are really threatened out in the wild. So there's the pressures of climate change, there's the pressures of particularly grazing, and if we can work in association with these guys to get them to understand the absolutely amazing importance of all these plants, and that we can all help together to guarantee their future. Because unfortunately, as the world heats up, the places for these tulips to grow on the mountains is only going to get higher and higher, and eventually, unfortunately, it will start to run out. So it's important that botanic gardens like us have these collections, so if anything ever gets critical, there's always that collection somebody can we can go back to and hopefully reintroduce into the wild.
They had, previous to the when this tulip project was first started, sort of in 2019, none of the tulip species in Central Asia had actually been red listed.
Yeah.
So, going forward, now everyone has a much better understanding of the threats that are sort of occurring in Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan specifically. So, it's kind of, we can see the urgency. So I think that a lot more stuff is being done now to try and help preserve them.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You've got some really nice tulips there, and one of the ones is probably, I suppose, one that I grew for probably 25 years ago for the first time was Tulipa acuminata, and it's a
we've got it here, Alan.
Its head, yeah, there it is. I have to say, it persisted with me for about 10 years, and at last I don't have it anymore. But it is a very strange fellow, isn't it?
It's a very strange bedfellow. I think when it was named acuminata, it was thought to be a species tulip.
Yeah.
But no tulip really looks like that. And I think DNA has now confirmed that we're definitely not dealing with a species. So we're dealing with a cultivar.
Right.
It's now called cornuta. And there are records of it, I think, in some of those fantastic paintings you see by the Dutch.
Yeah.
Back in the 16th century. So it's definitely must be one of the oldest or hybrids or cultivars we've got of tulips. And they reckon it must be goes back to that introduction by the Ottomans into Istanbul. So and then it came to Europe. People grew it in their gardens, and it's escaped. So I think you can see it naturalized in some bits of France and along the Mediterranean basin.
I wish it would do it here.
Yeah, it's not that easy. It isn't that easy. It really doesn't like winter wet.
Yeah.
It's summer wet. So I'd imagine it's come originally, the parentage must have come from high up.
Yeah.
So, because it doesn't like moisture.
I'm going to try it in the desert. Who knows?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, you're pretty dry up there, aren't you? So
we are, yeah.
So that's one that is peeping rather flamboyantly in on the edge of your screen. Where would you like to go next with some show and tell from the collection?
Well, I think this one actually is Kathryn and mine favourite.
Yeah, we both said before we sat down, like, what would you say your favourite was? This is Tulipa montana.
It really is beautiful. It comes from the Elbrus Mountains in Iran, and it's quite diminutive. So it only grows about 10 centimeters, 15 centimeters tall, beautiful cup-shaped flower. So the tops of the tepals, or if you want to call them petals and sepals, are quite rounded. They're not pointed at all. And they're just the most fantastic carmine red. They really are. A black blotch in the middle, a little bit of yellow around the black blotch. To me, it's the quintessential sort of tulip. And it's one of those tulips that's one of those typical snow melt plants. So where it grows in the wild, as soon as the snow disappears, within, I'd imagine, 5 to 6 days of the snow disappearing, it's flowering. I mean, in the wild, they're much, much harsher. They're much harsher soils. They get much harsher weather. They grow a lot smaller. So, in the wild, I wouldn't be surprised to see Montana flowering at sort of 5 to 6 centimeters. So it's a great tulip.
It's a great subject for a pot or a pan, though.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's an easy one for the garden. Unfortunately, I think it's one you're most probably going to grow in a cold house or in a pot, and then dig your bulbs up, look after them in somewhere, put them somewhere nice and cool and dark for the winter, and then replant them. So,
such a fantastic colour.
And oh, this is a nice one. A heavy pot, mind. And this was one of the, this is Huii, and it's yellow and it has these lovely golden orange sort of markings to the outer tepals. And it comes from most tulips. If you think of Kyrgyzstan and those Stan republics, they've mostly gone west. So they've mostly gone sort of through Iran, through the Caucasus, and ended up going through the Med, where Huii has gone slightly southeast. They've gone to Afghanistan. So this guy's from Afghanistan. And I think it was discovered about 20 years ago. So it's a relatively new introduction.
Is it quite unusual where it flowers in pairs?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the smaller flowered tulips, so sort of like Biflorus, Turgistanica, Huii, they tend to be a bit smaller and they tend to be the flowering stems tend to hold many flowers, 2 to 5.
Wow.
Where those big sort of classic tulips we all think of from coming from Amsterdam, those big red ones tend to be single flowered because they're so big.
Boiled eggs on sticks.
Yeah, eggs on sticks, absolutely.
We also have this
this is cool.
This is really cool. Tulipa regalii. I'm not sure if you can see the incredible sort of serrated leaf.
It's pleated,
isn't it, in flower at the moment?
It's got
I mean, it flowered with us last year. So, and the flower's quite diminutive, if I'm honest. It's white with a sort of like an egg yolk center, only 2 centimeters across, 3 centimeters across, not much more than that. But this ridging here, it's a fantastic adaptation, I think, of the plant. It grows up from Almaty, and you go up from Almaty up towards Astana in Kazakhstan. So it grows on that Kazakh plateau, and I think it's the only tulip that's really found up there. And it's incredibly continental climate, really harsh, hot, virtually no rain. So when the rain does come, obviously it's sort of increasing its surface area, and those ridges all go back down into the bulb. So when it rains,
that's what I was thinking. Yeah, I think
masses of water.
That's marvelous how plants actually do adapt to making that thing. You know, they make the most of their climate to try and capture whatever it is they need, and that tulip has developed ridges that act like little drainage channels.
Absolutely. Now I've done something wrong this year, I think, because it hasn't flowered, so it can be shy. And also I think the sad thing for some of us in Cambridgeshire, is that sort of the leaf height there, where in the wild the base of that leaf will be on the base of the ground. It will be really short, but because where we grow them, sometimes we don't get enough sunshine, they pull away a little bit.
Yeah.
So
well, it's interesting with the foliage. I've not sadly thought that much about tulip foliage in my gardening past. In fact, when it comes around to my Flomo, that's probably one of the first times I have thought about tulip leaves. And often they just can be an ugly mass of foliage that you're sort of stuck with when the flower has gone over. But is there a wide range, and does it tell you much about the plant and where it's from and what it wants?
Yeah, I always hedge a bet. So if something's small, I always think if a tulip's small and it's relatively small leaf, a particularly small flowered, I always think it most probably a good chance it comes from high up. So I think generally those bigger, bolder tulips come from lower altitude. So, might be found up to around 2,000 meters, where something like Alschnerii, which we have here, Tarda, which is one you can get easily for your gardens, that grows up to around 3,500 meters. So those little ones, I think, come from harsher climes higher up the mountain. But as far as the colours, they tend to either be sort of glaucous, that grey green. Saxatilis, that's a really beautiful. It's that very similar to bakerii that Alan was talking about. And that has a really glossy green foliage, which is quite different to most of the others, which are glaucous. Width, and we've got linifolia, and that kind of pushes us to its light, it's thin foliage, which it is, and it's very narrow foliage, only 0.5 centimeter across, most probably less than that. And then you get one like undulatifolia, which is really broad-leaved, hairy on the edge, and really glaucous. And also undulatifolia, it undulates up and down. Yeah. So there is some variation, but regalii, the one we talked about earlier, definitely the best leaf.
Yeah, I mean, the one that's right next to you, Kathryn, that looks quite thinner leaf. This very elegant white flowered tulip is beautiful.
Yeah, this is incredible. And I manage the Alpine house. So Simon does all of the behind the scenes work, and then I get to just bring them out when they're looking beautiful. And this one is always a favorite with the public. We get a lot of comments on this, and we have quite a few pots, so sort of dotting them around display. You know, white is the brightest color, and it has these beautiful little pink stripes along the petal as well.
What's it called?
Clusiana.
Clusiana.
And you were talking, it's very pretty. The common name is the lady tulip.
Yeah.
There we go.
There are several name forms of that: peppermint stick and cynthia, and
Absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think there's certainly in the species, there are about 3 or 4 different subspecies. That one there, Kathryn, that's a lovely one.
Yes, yeah.
This is another
This is another
Clusiana
favourite.
Kathryn's got. And this is bar chrysantha. So it's yellow.
yeah.
The sort of orange markings to the outer tepals. But it's the same species as the other, but just a slight variance in the wild.
And again, talking about leaves, they're sort of so erect, and then they sort of fall down so nicely. So it's a lovely one to grow in a pot.
Definitely.
It actually looks like an explosion in a waterfall.
It
Yeah.
does, yeah. Nice way to describe it. It's got quite a few more buds coming as well, so it's a good one for the Alpine house.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing I really like about tulips, and some bulbs, you know, they are great, but sometimes they can get overshadowed by the foliage. The foliage could be too tall. I always love a tulip because it sits well above the foliage.
Yes.
And you know, the foliage might be big, but at least the flowers sit above it, which is I think that's a good characteristic.
Are there any others off screen that we haven't managed to see?
We've got this one here. So this is Altrii. I'm not great at speaking my Latin, and it's a tiny, tiny little flower. I mean, that really is quite dainty. So, I think this guy comes from sort of one of the hot spots of the world for species tulips. So this comes from Turkey. The other ones we've talked about, the Central Asia, the Stan republics. And I suppose the other hot spot really is Crete. But this is a great one. I always think this is great for alpine pots or an alpine trough. An old, if you've got an old sink or something, it's that sort of diminutive little. It really is beautiful. And there's a white form of this.
Simon, if people are listening to this and they're thinking, well, he's described this so well, I'd like to have a go at growing these species tulips in pots. And it does sound as if it's something that, you know, the general public, people like me, may be able to do. How easy is it to get bulbs to start you off with? I mean, are they? They're not readily.
There aren't that many around. There are a few bulb specialists. Or as Kathryn was saying, you were saying societies.
Yeah. We've sort of gotten quite a few sets of seeds of species tulips from different societies, and also index seminums. If you've got the benefit of being attached to a botanic garden like we are, we get a lot of our seed
Absolutely.
from index seminums.
Alpine Garden Society, they always have a really good seed list, and they often have tulips.
Yeah.
So
even at the meetups, I remember when I first got into horticulture, and I was quite a keen member of the Alpine Garden Society, and we'd have these events, and at the end there'd always be a plant sale where people were sharing their material. Yeah,
there's one up your way, I think, Alan, up at Wyndham in May.
There is, yes, the Alpine Garden Society. Yeah,
they're most probably able to get some tulips there. So visit the shows as well.
Here's hoping.
Yeah, they're great, those events. And obviously we've mentioned in the past many times, it's like a mascot plant of this podcast, sprengeri. There are a few that are more widely available, and if you head to something, we've featured Scamps on a daffodil special, and they do a few species tulips as well, and a few hybrid tulips. There are the kind of mainstays of the kind of catalogue trade. So what would be your kind of top picks for the easiest beginner species tulips to try?
If you wanted to naturalize them in the garden like sprengeri, you could always use sylvestris is always good, and saxatilis, because the key with those guys is they're stoloniferous. So what they do is they produce a bulb, and then they produce a new bulb that's attached to the old bulb, and they sort of attach it maybe sort of 10-15 centimeters away. So eventually that will spread through a grass swarm, and they can look really effective. They're not.
Sounds as if it's doing a kind of the crocosmia type thing almost.
Yeah, I mean, almost, Alan, in a kind of way. Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with sylvestris, it doesn't like it overly wet.
Right.
So if you put it in a grass sward, you know, the drier the grass sward for the tulip, most probably the better. So,
Yeah.
you know, don't go putting it next to a stream. It's most probably not going to do too well.
There's one species tulip that I particularly like, and that's originates, and you haven't mentioned that.
That is a really good, and it's quite easy to get.
Yeah.
And, I think it could also be called Tulipa wittialii. And I think they're very, very similar. And they're that orange sort of cut-shaped tulip. And that's a good, easy tulip for the ground.
And it's, of course, like lots of other species tulips, it has about it that daintiness, the way it holds itself. You talked about the lady tulip, Clusiana, and you know that they do have this way of being slightly smarter, slightly more elegant.
Absolutely. And they come back every year.
Yeah.
You know, that's the great thing with them. They're always there. Tulipa kaufmanniana, the lily tulip. That's a good, easy one. The lady tulip we've talked about, Clusiana, that's really quite easy. And another one is Fosteriana. If you've got a good dry spot, Fosteriana is that classic big red tulip. You know, it's bold, it's up there. Come and look.
Which now, Simon, comes in other colours.
Yeah,
I mean, it comes in whites and oranges and lemons as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think the tulip colour range is every colour apart from blue.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it does associate with blue amazingly in the garden. So if you've got anything blue, you know, forget-me-nots or mascari, or which is the grape hyacinth. I mean, they can look really beautiful against blues.
I think for forget-me-nots are much maligned and people forget. I mean, I remember seeing a scheme, I think it was probably at Kew Gardens years and years and years ago, and it was the common old blue forget-me-not, and it was a pink lily-flowered tulip. Don't ask me the name of the lily-flowered tulip, but I mean, it's probably just an ordinary pink lily flower. But I mean, I was blown away by it. But I wanted to fiddle with it. I wanted to put some white and green in there as well. Yeah, never mind.
Do you grow a lot of tulips? Do you grow a lot of tulips in your garden, Alan?
Yes, I do. But I mean, unfortunately, they're not long lasting with us. It's very, very strange because where you think a tulip is not going to do well, you know, stick some bulbs in, you've got 5 or 6 bulbs left, you're going around the garden and you don't want to take them back to the shed, so you dig a hole, put them in, leave them there, forget about them, and then when they flower, you think, oh, look at that, that's a nice surprise. And then you see it following 2, 3 and 4 years and you think, well, why is it growing there and not where I want it to? But that's tulips, I guess, or the hybrids anyway.
What about you, Thordis? If you're close to the Botanic Garden, I'm guessing you have maybe a smaller garden. Are you growing any in pots?
Well, so my most exciting thing, as I shared possibly in our last episode, was that a few years ago I sowed some Tulipa sprengeri, and I thought it had died. It germinated, but I thought I'd just left the tray in vain hope, and then this spring I've spotted that it's back. So that's my most exciting. But on a slightly less exciting front, my front garden is baked. My back garden is extremely shady and north facing, but I experimented with putting is it Preston's Shogun, the sort of orangey yellow, low growing berry. Again, you kind of get when they're closed, it's a completely different effect to when they then open up and show their orange kind of va-va-voom side of their personality. And I've really had very little chance to enjoy them because I've been away so much over the last 10 days, typically while they've been doing their thing, but they are so happy. And I've got a Stachys, a lamb's ear, just a boring old Byzantinus, which is rather overtaken while the baby has been enjoying its first year. But the orange of that tulip with the silver foliage is really lovely. It sort of tones down the orange a little bit. So they're probably my most exciting tulip adventures in my small garden. What about you, Kathryn?
Well, I've just moved house and I've got my first garden that I'm going to be sort of able to do anything in. And at the moment, a dog was living there previously and it's just completely trashed. So it's got no lawn and everything is just overtaken with ivy. So I'm quite looking forward to experimenting and growing some different things. So I'll certainly be giving them a go, but not right now.
It's a very exciting point when that new garden is burgeoning and beckoning, which will bring us on to Flomo. But I should ask you, Simon, seeing as you head up this collection, you've got them all at work. Do you have any at home as well?
I've got a few at home. So I've got some hybrids in my garden just for, you know, that sort of nice bit of flower power, really. Apple Dawn's always I like Apple Dawn. It's good going. Got ballerina. They're really good cultivars, I think, in the garden, and they can be persistent. They can perenniate. They're sort of in a group called Darwin tulips, so they will flower year on year. And then I do have a few pots. I love easy to look after Clusiana vicrysantha, and it's just so easy. And which is the one we showed you earlier. This guy here. And it just looks lovely, really. And I have quite a lot of pot plants at home, and a lot of tulips really contrast well with large leaf things. You know, it doesn't actually have to be in flower. You know, you've got this big sort of impressive large leaf plant, and the backdrop to the tulip can look quite effective.
Yeah.
But I don't have that many, but I have a few. I much like you, I have a sun-baked garden. Mine happens to be at the back. It's quite small, and then a north-facing front, which doesn't really do very much.
No. Not a lot. I mean, I've been getting into shade plants, so that's exciting, like ferns, and seeing the hostas come through. That's exciting, not just for me. I'm sure the mollusks will be out there as well. Now, so, I mean, Kathryn, you must be drowning in this if you've got a new garden to plan. That's extremely exciting. And I could feel it bubbling up as you mentioned, particularly the species which are easy to try. My FLOMO, which is that kind of fear of missing out you get about a flower or a plant, is goes back to your Kaufmanniana. When I was sort of putting this podcast together, I looked back through some photos because I knew there was a random tulip I'd seen in a stately home garden I visited just sort of on a holiday. So I hunted back through my photos, and it was a Kaufmanniana hybrid called Heart's Delight. And it's
Nice.
I don't think it's, the most astonishing tulip, but it really stopped me. It wasn't a garden that was absolutely packed with interesting plants, but it was a lovely clump. And the most exciting thing, aside from these slightly blushing yellow scented flowers, which looked like they were sort of red backed petals, the foliage, which when I went to look up on the internet, no one seemed to talk about the foliage particularly, but it was really sort of stripy and exciting. And I've never thought about planting a tulip for its foliage before. And so I thought, well, maybe this is one that I can add to my small collection. Tulips don't have many spots in my garden, so I can't have very many, but maybe that's one that's worth trying for me. What about you guys? Where are you two at with your FLOMO?
Well, I obviously work in the glass houses and spend most of my time looking after tropical plants. So it was quite fun sort of with this trip to Kyrgyzstan. It was just completely different, nothing that I had seen before really, but I was getting quite into the sort of more alpine plants from working here. And I think mine would probably have to be Trollius lilacinus. Which is an incredible blue little flower that we saw sort of way up. I think it was like 3,400 meters or something. And, we'd never be able to grow it here in Cambridge at 14 meters. It was just peeking through the snow. And we were so lucky to see it because there had been a snowfall the night before, and there was just one poking up through the snow. And we were able to sort of, brush it off, and there was a whole carpet of them, and they were absolutely beautiful. But that would be a wonderful thing to be able to display in the Alpine house here at Cambridge. But unfortunately, I just don't think it would ever work.
I think you might be right. Yeah, it might be
Wow.
tricky.
Yeah,
What an amazing story, though.
Yeah.
What about you, Simon?
We've got one. I remember planting this plant as seed about 5-6 years ago and it's flowered for the first time this year rather, and it's Iris acutiloba. And it's a fantastic sort of it's like a bearded iris. It's in a really difficult group to grow called the Onosiculus iris, and they all sort of come from either sort of around Israel and Persia, or they sort of go down into Iran, but they don't go much further east than that. It only sits about 10 centimeters, 15 centimeters tall, and the flower's really big. And it's the colors. I'm not going to sell you on the colors because I can say it's sort of like a dingy brown, and it's got a little bit of purple, a little bit of cream, but it is just stunningly beautiful. And it has these tiny little deep purple spots on the fulls. That's my go-to plant this week. Next week it will be over, and I'll have to find a new one.
Do you think you didn't like it more considering you
I definitely like it more because I've waited a long time for that to flower. It's that nice journey.
I think brown flower's got a lot going for it. I'm happy with that. Alan, what about your FLOMO?
Well, my FLOMO is vast, you know it is. But I mean, on a Onosiculus hybrid irises, I always remember reading about them, and just they're thinking they're a no-go for you because they are just too difficult. And they probably are, because they're a very small part of a large garden, if you like.
Absolutely.
My Flomo's got to be. I have to say, you two guys, you've fired me up to do species tulips in pots, and I've got these two. So, well, I call them raised beds. They're not that raised actually, but if you can imagine, they're about 4 feet by 7 feet, I suppose, and they're raised by about 30 centimeters, not quite 30 centimeters, maybe 20 centimeters, maybe a bit more. But I could dig those out and make a couple of sand beds, you see.
Definitely.
And I'm thinking immediately that's the kind of thing, because when you open your garden to the public, you're always thinking of sort of side issues that people could be interested in. Not everybody is, of course, but you're trying to sort of, well, I suppose, further the cause of gardening and just display another facet to the way of gardening and things. And I think it's an ideal thing for people that have got small garden to actually try and grow tulips in pots. But there's always a but. And this is a big but. You really need a small garden and almost as much space again to store the pots when they're not in flower.
It's very true. It's very true. But you will have a wonderful, wonderful collection of terracotta pots.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're nice things to collect.
Yeah, they are indeed. They're getting ever more expensive, Simon.
They are, frighteningly so.
Yeah.
Well, Alan's feeling inspired. I think we all are. It has been a wonderful voyage, not just across to Kyrgyzstan, but through your collection. Thank you so much, Simon and Kathryn, for spending the time, and I think giving us so many ideas for not only what to grow, but how to grow it as well. So improving all of our kind of horticultural endeavours, which is always the aim on Talking Dirty. Anyway, until next time, happy gardening.
Thank you. Bye.
Happy gardening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I wish I knew where my hair clip was, and I would try and tame this. I mean, what is this? It's like a Teletubby antenna on the side of my head.
Thordis, it's a wayward bang.
Yeah, you're with the times, Thordis.
This is the very, very, very lovely Helen. Anything we do with the Botanics is always because of lovely Helen, who is wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
If we make any mistakes, I am actually delighted because we have a little blooper section at the end. So, if a flower falls off when you're trying to show it to the camera, or if, something goes wrong, someone walks in, it's great because I'm just like, brilliant.
Yeah, plant them. Oh gosh, now I've lost track of where I was going with that conversation. Sorry.
We know you've got some wonderful, wonderful plants, but some of the things that I look at when I'm going around a garden is, believe it or not, door furniture, handles, locks, hinges. And the locks and hinges in your glass house are to die for. They're absolutely fantastic.
I tell you what isn't good about them. They are so loud when you're recording a radio interview.
Yeah.